So, as I said, there are a couple people with us in the room, but I think majority of people are joining us online today. So as you may have, oh, that's right. I'm just gonna quickly, all of the people joining us on Teams have moved right in front of the presentation that I have up behind me, so they're just moving you over. Give me a moment. There we go. Well, I will get us started. So, making sense of the senses, we're doing a sort of two-part series. So today is part one, which is just a lot of those really early, sort of just the foundations of what sensory processing is, understanding a little bit about the senses, understanding sort of how sensory processing impacts our day-to-day, what different sensory, differences or processing can kind of look like. It's very sort of introductory just to get you kind of understanding a little bit of what's happening and what's going on. And then our next lunch and learn, which will be September, Hannah, who's our director, she's going to take part two, where she's going to go through a little bit more of like, what can we do? What are some strategies? How can we support with this sensory stuff? So yeah, like I said, it's very sort of foundational, but I still hope that it is helpful and that you learn things. If you have questions, like I said, feel free to pop them in the chat or let me know. Just talk, unmute yourself and let me know. Okay, so our learning goals kind of for today are understanding the basics of sensory processing and sensory modulation, mostly just sort of getting a really background kind of understanding of what's going on when we talk about sensory processing and what we mean. Understand the 8 senses and what they do, understand what differences in sensory processing can look like and how we might be able to notice some of what might be happening for some people in that way, and explore why understanding sensory needs is important for everyday life. So what is sensory processing? So sensory processing refers to the way our brain receives, interprets, and then responds to sensory information from our body and environment. So we have this sort of cycle. We get the sensory input, and then the sensory input gets processed. Our brain sort of does that all for us, and then we respond. What's really important to know and understand about this process of sensory processing is that it's all a reflex. It's all like automatic. It happens within seconds. It's not something that we actively are necessarily choosing. Our brain is doing it automatically. Okay, so this is a little diagram that I put together of the brain and things here. Now what I'm going to explain to you is very simplified version of what is kind of going on when our brain processes this sort of information and what's kind of happening. This is not anatomically correct. It's just, this is often what I will draw out for families and parents when they're wanting to understand a bit more about what's happening from a sensory point of view. And I just sort of draw it out and I say, it's not anatomically correct. It's just to help give you a visual of what's kind of going on. So we have this sensory input that we get from the world around us, or our muscles, our joints, from our senses, all the bits and pieces, and that comes up through our nervous system, through our brainstem, and then our brain then filters it and decides where it should kind of get sent to be processed and to be understood and then to respond to it. So it kind of, we could say it gets sent to one of 3 kind of places. So it'll either get sent to the working part of the brain, which means our brains notice this sensory information that we're getting is important. We should pay attention to it. We should respond to it. It's not dangerous or anything. We just, it's important information. It goes to our working part of the brain. We need to be paying attention to this stuff. So that could be, someone talking to you, me talking to you. It could be, someone tapping you on the shoulder. It could be whatever it might be. It's just this information, not dangerous, but important. The other place it gets sent is it gets filtered out. So that means our brain has noticed, okay, this information that we're getting is not really important. It might be repetitive, not really relevant, not worth taking up that thinking, working brain space. So that could be maybe for some people the sound of the aircon, it kind of, you've heard it for so long, it gets filtered out. It's not the same. Your brain isn't paying attention to it the same way it would someone talking. Or the feeling of your clothes on your body. Like I can feel I've got pants and shoes and jumper. I can feel that on my body, but my brain and my body isn't noticing that and processing that and understanding that in the same way it would someone tapping me on the shoulder, because it's my brain's like, oh, I felt that all day. I know what that is. It's just your clothes. I know what that feeling is. I don't need to pay attention to it anymore. So that kind of, the idea of kind of trying to decide and figure out where it goes is called something like sensory gating. And it's sort of this idea of going, okay, what do we need to notice and what do we need to not notice? And the other place it gets sent is to our danger center. So that's going straight away. This information we're getting, it is dangerous. We're going into fight, flight, freeze. This information is going to send me into that space because it's dangerous. And that's when our danger zone, our danger brain kicks in. We go into fight, flight, freeze mode. So that could be anything. Maybe, you hear a loud bang and so your heart starts racing. You're kind of in fight or flight or freeze or whatever happens to you. Or I don't know, I feel something crawling up my leg. So my heart starts beating really fast. I go into fight mode. I'm like whacking at my leg. My brain doesn't know whether that is dangerous. It thinks that it's dangerous, but sometimes it may not be. It might just be a hair or a piece of grass. But that sensation has gone straight to the danger center because my brain has associated that information is dangerous. So that's sort of what is happening in the background of sensory processing and how our senses get processed and understood. So sensory modulation is sort of a part of sensory processing. And sensory modulation is the brain's ability to regulate how much we respond to sensory input. It's how we stay balanced, not too overwhelmed, but also not tuned out and under responsive. So all of us sensory modulate, like we all do that without noticing it, probably a lot of the time. Some things that I might do myself throughout the day to sensory modulators, I might listen to headphones if I'm getting distracted by the cars and the beeping in the car park, or people having a yap in the office, or I find myself getting a little bit tired or feeling a little like getting the 3 p.m. days or the snoozes happening. So I choose to have a crunchy snack in the afternoon, because I know that kind of alerts me, or having something sour. We have a couple of sour lollies in the office that can kind of get us alert. So those are some things that we do, and I think Hannah will probably talk a little bit more in depth about what sensory modulation is, but sensory modulation, I guess, is kind of a part of sensory processing. It's what we do every day to manage. So if we go back to this sort of picture of the brain, sometimes what can happen is, if depending on sort of our sensory profile or depending on our experiences as well, things might get sent to places in the brain where we may not think that they would typically sort of maybe should go. So maybe things that we would expect to get filtered out, like background noise or the feeling of our clothes on our body, actually get sent to the working part of the brain, and they can become really irritating, or they can be really annoying or really uncomfortable, or we're really distracted by all these things that other people may be able to just filter out and they're not paying attention to it. But someone, if their sensory profile might be a bit more sensitive, they might be noticing that information more than others, and it's going to that working part and filling that working part of the brain up. Or something that could just be going to the working part of the brain might be getting sent to the danger center. We might be seeing danger responses, like fight, flight, freeze responses to things that we might not typically expect would elicit that kind of response. Or it can go the other way as well. Things are getting filtered out, things are getting missed, that information is not getting, I guess, paid attention to or processed the way that we would expect when we might expect it to go to that working part of the brain. Okay, so that's sort of that background part of what sensory processing is. Now I'm going to go through and talk about the 8 senses. So there are 8 senses. I'm going to go through all of them. There's probably the ones that you would typically understand and know, and then I can go through some of the other ones that are a little bit more difficult to kind of notice and difficult to understand, but we'll talk through those as well. So we have auditory, which is things we can hear, the sound, so processing sounds, including speech, music, background noise, things we can hear pretty much. Visual, so things we can see, our sight. So it helps us see and interpret what's around us, like colors and shapes and movement, light, anything we can see. Gustatory, which helps us experience flavors, sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami. So that's sort of that taste sense. And then olfactory detects the sense, so the things we can smell, scents and odors, which can impact memory, emotion, and appetite. So it's helpful to know, particularly if you're ever working with maybe people who have had some adverse life experiences or they've experienced some trauma. Olfactory is one of those senses that can really sneak up on people, and we don't realize that people are having perhaps these fight or flight responses to olfactory, because that can be one that can really quickly and sort of like bypass some of that filtering process and go straight to that danger center. So we'll often have people kind of going, smelling a smell that reminds them of a specific event, or a smell that whatever it might be, and they can be going into these fight, flight, freeze kind of experiences, and they don't realize why, because they may not have seen anything or heard anything or remembered anything, but it could be a smell. So smells have a really, really close relationship to our emotions and experience and memories. So that's always a good one to notice and think about when you're working, if you're working with people, or even for yourself or for family members. If you're kind of like, I feel like there was nothing else, maybe just have a think about what smells were present. And then we've got tactile, so the things we can feel, tells us about texture, pressure, temperature, pain through our skin. So that's sort of that light touch, so things we can feel on the surface of our skin. So someone tapping us, clothes on our body, like for temperature, texture, things like that. And now these other three ones are the ones where I think can get a little bit more confusing, or the ones that people don't know as much about. So we have vestibular processing, which comes from the inner ear, helps us with balance, coordination, knowing where our body is in space. So if that comes from our inner ear, I sort of say to people, it's sort of, if it helps you understand inertia, like, are you moving fast? Are you moving slow? Is your head upright? Is your head like sideways to the world? Kind of works in with gravity and our inner ear and our balance, and it can kind of help us with that movement processing, but where our body is in relation to the rest of the world. So where is our body in space? Then proprioception kind of works very closely with vestibular, but it is different. So proprioception senses the movement and pressure in our joints and our muscles and helps us know where our body is, or where our body parts are and how they're moving. So the proprioception is the sense that helps us understand where our body is in relation to itself. So sometimes I will use the example, explain this to people as like, if I were to close my eyes and someone were to move my body, like this, without me having to open my eyes, I could tell my right hand is bent and on my head, and my left arm is out in front of me with my thumbs up, because there are, nerves and muscles and joints and stuff sending that information to my brain so that I know where my body is in relation to itself. So that, again, along with vestibular, those are really important for our things like coordination and our movement and, pushing things and pulling things and picking things up and understanding sort of what is going on with our body, which is really important. And then the last one is interoception. So this helps us feel the internal cues like thirst, hunger, needing the toilet, feeling pain, and emotions. So interoception, I think, has been more relatively, not like new, but it has I guess, gotten more research and more information is coming out about how interoception impacts people and what that looks like, and noticing how, if particularly like our young people, if they're having a hard time with their emotions, it may be that they're actually unable to identify what emotions feel like in their body. They may not know what that feeling is, or how to notice it, or how to identify it, especially if they have difficulties with interoception. It can kind of be hard to identify what's going on, or maybe, they have a hard time differentiating what's going on inside. So, feeling hungry can feel maybe the same as feeling anxious, which maybe feels the same as needing to go to the toilet. Like, things can kind of get mixed up and confused. So interoception is really important for that. And then even things like safety, like understanding if I'm hurt, understanding if I've got a headache or if I'm sick, things like that. So those are our 8 senses. So then now moving on to a sensory processing framework. So this one is by Winnie Dunn, who created the sensory profile. So it kind of looks a little bit confusing and complex, but I will explain what this is about. So pretty much, Winnie Dunn says there's two main, continuums or threshold sort of things. There are two kind of axes that we can live on in terms of our sensory needs or our sensory processing, sensory profiles. So this up and down one, which I've kind of highlighted a little bit over here, which I can talk about more, is our neurological threshold. So hypo, which means we have a high neurological threshold. So up here I've put like a big cup. So high threshold means that we need more sensory information to fill that cup. High threshold means we notice it less than others. We may need more of the sensory information to be able to fill our cup so that we notice and understand what's happening in our body or in the world around us. Some people will say, sometimes this confuses people, but sometimes this really helps people get it. A high threshold means a lot only seems like a little. So you need more. So a lot of sensory information only seems like a little to your brain, so you need more. And then down the other end, so hypersensitivity or a lower neurological threshold is like having a smaller sensory cup. So you need less sensory information to fill your cup. You need less sensory information to notice what's going on. And it can be easy for that cup to be overflowed, I suppose, because it is smaller. So we can kind of be anywhere on this neurological threshold for all of our senses. And we might notice that although our sort of sensory profile and our processing doesn't necessarily change, it can be that kind of some days you might be able to cope better than others. And so it can seem kind of like it moves around a bit, but we can be anywhere sort of on this continuum for all of our different senses. So that is the up and down neurological threshold, and then the side by side, horizontal. I always say them wrong, even though I know what they are, but the horizontal axis. So we have one side, which is passive self-regulation, and the other side is active self-regulation. So this, I guess, line or continuum is talking about how we respond when our sensory needs are not being met in whatever way. So maybe we're overstimulated or we're understimulated. This is sort of talking about how do we respond. And so on one end, you have people who might be passive responders. So if they say have a low neurological threshold, so they're more sensitive than others to sensory information, and they are passive, they might be the ones who sort of just sit there and shut down when they're overwhelmed, or they just sit there and they cry, or it's the internalizing, like they're not really doing much to get away. They're not actively moving out of the space or avoiding the activities. They're just sort of experiencing the discomfort and sitting there. Whereas the other end, if they had a low neurological threshold and a high sensitivity, they might be more active in their wanting to perhaps avoid the things that they're sensitive to or leaving the place that is overwhelming. So these might be the people who are going to run out of a classroom, or they're going to leave the place, or they're covering their ears, or they're doing what they can to kind of get out and stop, actively doing something to get out and stop or leave the situation, or move away from the discomfort of that. And then the other side, so if we have a high neurological threshold and we're passive in our self-regulation, this can kind of be people, like it's called, I think Winnie Dunn has used the word like bystander, but it's sort of that can seem really passive, and sort of like if they're not noticing sensory information, it can be a little bit like, like hard to get them moving, hard to get them activated. Some people might say, like lights on, but no one's really home. Like we're really slow. We're meant to do a lot of work to get them to like be active and move and get going. Whereas the other one, which is we have a high neurological threshold, so we need more sensory information, but we're active, these are going to be our sensory seekers. So the people who are, say if they have a high threshold and active in their movement seeking. They're the ones running and jumping and climbing and swinging and crashing and again and again and again and again. And they're really seeking that information because they need more information and they are moving more active in their seeking of that. So yeah, that is very briefly the rundown of sort of Winnie Dunn's sensory processing framework. And the reason why I wanted to just pull out this high threshold, low threshold cup, just because I find that people find it makes more sense to people when we can use things like cups for analogies. So high threshold, we're thinking a big sensory cup. We need more sensory information to fill it. Low threshold, we have a small sensory cup. It doesn't take as much to fill it. And yeah, so we can kind of be anywhere along that continuum. You might sort of sit in the middle. You might find that maybe for auditory information, you're sort of sitting on that lower threshold, whereas for proprioception or vestibular information, you're sitting right at that high threshold, but then for visual information, you're kind of right in the middle and not really sitting either way. Okay, so I thought we could talk through a little bit about what hypersensitivity or a low threshold, and then the other way, what hypo or a high threshold might look like for different senses. This is not an exhaustive list. This is not an extensive list. This isn't even, it's like touching the surface, but I just wanted to get in a couple of dot points to kind of prompt us with things to talk about or give us a couple of ideas of what it could look like. So a hypersensitivity to or a lower threshold for visual information or things you can see might notice that people are really sensitive to bright lights or prefer to sort of have their blinds closed during the day, don't really like that bright kind of glowing lights or want to spend time in dark lighting, bothered by busy patterns or visual clutter, or they might find that they, are bothered by really fast moving visual movies or TV where there's like lots of things going on, or you might find that they are overwhelmed when there's lots of movement around them. So they're at a busy shopping center, or they're at a park or at a festival and there's people. That is a whole multiple things in that sensory experience. But from that visual point of view, it could be that there's people, the moving, the lights, all sorts of things that can be overwhelming if they have a lower threshold or a smaller sensory cup for that. Auditory, might you notice that they're distressed or startled by loud or unexpected sounds, maybe startled or having bigger responses than we might expect to a loud sound, maybe covering their ears, getting really distressed, covering their ears frequently, having a hard time in those noisy environments, so maybe feeling overwhelmed. And I guess keeping in mind, you may not always notice it if they're more of that passive responder. They might just sort of seem a little bit like not doing super well or feeling a little bit like on the lower, like feeling a little flat or sort of zoning out. Whereas if they're more active, they might be trying to leave or run away. And then also struggling to focus with background noise. So this is one that I often sort of explain to some of my young people and they go, oh my goodness, yes, that makes sense. So an example I often give is maybe in the classroom, if you are sensitive to sound or you have a lower neurological threshold for that auditory information, your brain is not filtering out the same information that everyone else might be from that auditory point of view. So, for example, you may try to be listening to the teacher in class. You can hear the teacher talking, but you can also hear the person behind you who's breathing really loud, the person beside you who's tapping their pen, the classroom next door who's laughing, the person outside who's doing a wheelie bin, plus the bird that's flying over, and all these other things that other people kind of just filter out. But that is all going to the working part of your brain, and it can then be really difficult to kind of pull out and identify and focus on the teacher talking when you're hearing all this other information. It's easy to get distracted by all of that other information, that auditory information. Yes, and then tactile, so touch information. So perhaps they are more sensitive to that touch information, so disliking certain clothing or clothing textures, having a hard time with tags or seams, avoiding things that are going to be messy or things that give them that feeling that they don't like, maybe sticky things or whatnot, reacting strongly to unexpected touch. So maybe someone might tap them on the shoulder and they're having this big response that you maybe wouldn't expect, or getting really distressed by certain unexpected touch information, difficulties with self-care tasks. So that's things like, maybe brushing teeth, brushing hair, having showers, all that sort of stuff can be, especially if you're sensitive to touch, can be a really difficult sensory experience if that's a sensation that you find really difficult to manage. Brushing teeth, that is, your mouth is a very sensitive place, and toothbrushes are not always fun if you're really sensitive in that sort of space, or brushing our hair if you have a sensitive scalp, that can be a really difficult feeling, not liking the water on your face or in your eyes. And then olfactory, so smell, overwhelmed by strong or specific smells, or complains about odors that other people don't notice. So can you smell that? It's really horrible, or having a really hard time managing in those really strong smelling things. They gag or become nauseated from certain smells, or maybe you notice that they're avoiding going to places like some certain shopping centres or certain aisles in the shops where there's lots of smelly things, or not going into, like, I don't know, Lush or the really smelly stores, or getting a bit overwhelmed, or struggling if there's really strong perfume. So, like, I kind of choose and try my hardest not to wear any really strong smelling sort of perfumes or scents or whatnot, because I just know that, as we spoke about before, like olfactory, we don't know what kind of young people are coming in if there's a smell that they've smelt before and it's really horrible, or they just don't like that smell and then it's really irritating and it's distracting for them in our sessions. But that's just sort of me, and what I choose to do in our sessions. Taste, might be picky with foods, avoiding any spicy or sour or things that are sort of too different. If they're sensitive to that taste, have strong dislike or gagging in response to certain foods, but also we're thinking about, if we're sensitive to taste, we can notice the difference that other people miss. So they might be very particular about a certain type of food or a certain brand of food, or don't really like fruits and vegetables because, you can get one blueberry that tastes great and the other blueberry is really sour. And if sour for them is really intense and that really fills up their sensory card, really horrible experience. Whereas maybe for me, I'm not particularly sensitive to taste. So if I have a sour blueberry, it's like, oh, that's rough, but it's not no big deal for me. But if you are more sensitive to that, that can be quite alarming and overwhelming, especially if you're not expecting it. And then proprioception. So proprioception, I have never yet come across someone who has a low threshold for proprioception, but I guess it can happen. But may find certain physical activities uncomfortable, avoiding any sort of physical effort, avoiding rough play or anything like that, because it could be that those any of that movement could be causing discomfort or uncomfortable for them. Vestibular, so movement and balance sort of thing. So disliking swings, not liking spinning, not liking climbing, becoming dizzy or nauseated easily, avoiding escalators or lifts or any of those things where it kind of moves in that way that feels unnatural or maybe unsettling for them, where they're getting that sort of movement and relying on that inner ear, that balance, that vestibular processing to notice where their body is in relation to the rest of the world. Like, if you think about the fact that you may not know sort of where your body is in space, that can be really alarming and really unnerving to not know where your body is. And then interoception, sensitivity to interoception, maybe over-aware of internal sensations, which might be really uncomfortable. They feel discomfort more intensely. So a headache can be really, really intense, or even like the needing to use the toilet can be a really, really intense and uncomfortable feeling. Might find that they become anxious about their body signals. So really hyper-aware and anxious of what feeling is going inside their body. Or strong emotional responses to minor internal cues. So maybe we get really distressed when we're hungry because it's a really uncomfortable feeling. We've got a headache and that's really, really horrible because we're feeling it so much more than what other people may be feeling. Then the other end, so hyposensitivity, so having a high threshold or a big sensory cup for visual information. So maybe often missing things that are right in front of them. So we're needing more of this visual information to notice what's going on. We might be missing stuff. Seeking out bright lights or fast-moving visuals, sort of seeking that visual information. Auditory doesn't respond to the name being called, appears tuned out or like they're not really listening, may not notice or react to loud noises, and enjoys making loud sounds or repetitive noises. Now, interestingly, with a lot of these, which is where sensory stuff can get super complicated, is that some of these auditory, I guess, more seeking type behaviors, like humming or making loud sounds or making repetitive noises, can actually be coping strategies for being sensitive to auditory information. So if you are sensitive to sound and you're in a noisy environment and you're overwhelmed, maybe you start humming and singing or making a loud sound, because your own voice with your ear, especially if your hands covered over your ears, is much louder than all of the stuff going on around you. So it can actually be a coping mechanism for hypersensitivity, and also sometimes hypersensitivity, especially if we're maybe in a school environment and we're distracted and we feel like we're missing information, or this sort of missing, may not notice their name being called, or missing information, maybe needing to ask people to repeat things, can also perhaps be a sign sometimes of being hypersensitive. So if you're in a busy, noisy environment and someone's talking to you, but you can hear every other conversation at the same time and you can hear like every other noise, you may need to ask someone to repeat something to you, or you may have felt like you missed what they said, not because you haven't noticed the sound from that processing point of view, but because there was so much other sound that you kind of, it all mushed and blurred into one. And so it was difficult to pick out what it was that you were meant to be paying attention to. So just being mindful of that as well. So tactile, doesn't notice being messy or dirty, may not respond to touch or pain appropriately, enjoys touching everything, constantly fiddling with objects. Again, some of that like constant fidgeting and seeking information can also be kind of one of those coping strategies. Olfactory smell, doesn't notice strong smells, like not noticing a body odor, or not noticing smells like smoke, which can sometimes actually be really dangerous. A lot, which we'll come back to, but like a lot of these sensory things, if we have all these differences and we're not noticing things or we're missing stuff, it can actually impact our safety awareness. May sniff objects or people frequently, seems unaware of any unpleasant or dangerous smells, which you kind of spoke about a little bit earlier. So more high threshold or big economy sensory cut for taste, so maybe seeking out really intense flavors, shows very little response to really strong flavors, or wanting to eat really quickly, or craving those really bold, extreme kind of flavors in food. Vestibular, constantly. So I guess this vestibular and proprioception, this is what we may see a lot. And when we think about sensory seeking, this kind of might be what we think of. So constantly moving, running, spinning, jumping, wanting to get that movement, vestibular information, that swinging, the moving around, jumping up and down, craving that fast, intense movement, appearing fearless or unaware of danger, may rock, bounce, or spin to sort of self-soothe or whatever they need to kind of get that information that they need. And again, as I was speaking about before, if you have a big sensory cup for vestibular information and you're not getting enough of that, you're probably, as a reflex, going to be seeking that information, because if you don't know where your body is in relation to space, that's probably really uncomfortable and feels really strange, and your body is, as a reflex, going to want you to move around. So it's not like we're choosing to do these things. It's like my body needs this movement to feel settled and regulated and comfortable. Same with proprioception, they might appear clumsy or uncoordinated. They might use too much force. So, maybe kids playing with another kid and they're pulling them to the ground without noticing, or they're pushing them and they're like, oh, I didn't really think that was an issue. Or crashing into things or people on purpose, really liking that kind of really intense feeling, or seeking out deep pressure or heavy work. So deep pressure and heavy work, so that can be things like lifting heavy things or pushing things. Anything that's kind of really using those muscles is what we would call heavy work. And that can be a really good thing to implement, which I'm sure Hannah will probably talk about next time, to support regulation. And then interoception. So if we have a high threshold for interoception, difficulty recognizing internal cues, may not notice when they're hurt, tired, or sick, maybe having delayed responses to body needs. So not noticing that they need to go to the toilet until they are busting and they're in pain, or not noticing that they're sick until they're really, really sick, or struggling to identify or label emotions and body states. So like I said before, interoception is really important for noticing our emotions, because emotions are feelings. That's why they're called feelings, because we feel them. And so if we're having a hard time with interoception in any kind of way, it can be difficult to notice what we're feeling and what those feelings are. I feel like I'm just taking a quick breath because I just did a whole lot of yapping. So why does sensory processing matter? Why do we need to be aware of it? Why is it helpful to know what our own sensory needs are, or the sensory needs are of those people we're supporting or people in our family? Well, we live our life through our senses. Like, that is literally how we interact with the world and everything around us, and how we understand our body and what's going on inside of our body and where our body is. So, how we live our life. as I mentioned before, it really impacts our ability to concentrate, learn, and take on new information. So if we are not settled, if our body doesn't know where it is in relation to itself or in space, and so we have a kid who might be, moving around or getting fidgety or wiggly, or, you yourself are feeling really kind of unsettled and feel the need to kind of get up and going, your brain is going to have a really hard time taking on new information and noticing what's going on if you're not feeling sort of settled. It's going to be really hard to say learn something new when your body doesn't know where it is. Or like I was saying about before, if we're sensitive to certain information and we're in a classroom and it can be really overstimulating in the classroom, it's going to be really hard to listen to the teacher, notice the information we need to be taking on, learning that stuff when we're overwhelmed and overstimulated. Impacts our ability to identify and regulate our emotions. So, if we are feeling overstimulated and overwhelmed by certain sensory experiences, that can lead to big emotions. Might be feeling to really overwhelmed, and when we're really overwhelmed, maybe when we're, the word has left my brain, more susceptible to feeling angry or feeling sad or feeling worried, or these sensory experiences. You might find kids are worried and anxious and don't want to leave the house, or they don't want to go to the shops, and they're sort of noticing these anxiety symptoms. It could be that the shops are really overstimulating in a really horrible place, and every time they go they feel really overwhelmed and overstimulated, and it's really difficult and really uncomfortable for them. So that's really important for us to know. But then, as I was speaking about before with interoception, if we're having a hard time noticing the feelings in our body, it's going to be hard then to notice when I'm starting to feel, when I'm starting to feel silly and wiggly, then I need to implement these strategies. But if we don't know what it feels like to feel silly and wiggly, or we don't know what that feels like in our body, or we're unable to notice those feelings until I'm super, super wiggly and, running around the room or whatever, that can be really hard. And so really important to keep in mind where our young people or where we are at in terms of noticing our own body, because I think we can kind of expect ourselves and our young people to be able to, well, you need to notice when you're starting to feel angry and then use these strategies. They may not know what anger feels like. They may not know how to notice those early signs of anger in their body. So that's really important to keep in mind. It impacts our daily activities, like I was talking about before. Our ability to do our self-care tasks, our ability to cook food for ourselves, or to eat foods that we need to, or go out and about. It's difficult to maybe access community things in certain situations, like say we would really love to go to like an anime conference, but there are people everywhere, it's noisy, there's lights, it's going to be crazy, and I have a really hard time going to the anime conference unless we've really prepared ourselves and have a whole lot of great strategies and supports in place. But even then, it can still be really overwhelming. And then even in that social participation, so it can be hard, maybe even if we are, whatever it might look like, the way that our sensory profile is might mean that, I've worked with some couple of young people, particularly who are sensitive to touch, and so they don't like hugs, or they don't like it when someone trying to like touch their back and rubs their back affectionately, but that's really, really uncomfortable for them, maybe even painful. And so that can be really difficult, kind of navigating that with someone when, socially, or if maybe they're in a relationship and someone wants to like touch them on the back and they're like, that's really uncomfortable, I don't like that. Like that can be really challenging, having those kind of conversations with loved ones, or even parents or family or friends. So I think helping people know about their own sensory needs and what works for them is really, really important. And like I said before, it also impacts our safety awareness. So if we have a hard time noticing smells, for example, and we can't tell if it's smoke, or we can't tell if something smells off, or we don't know whether our food is off or something like that, that can be difficult. Or if we're not noticing, if we're seeking vestibular information and we've got kids who are like running and climbing and jumping and swinging and crashing, and they love that crashing feeling because it gets them that sensory input that they need, but they may not be noticing then when it's unsafe, or what is safe amount of movement, or way to move in that way, or also interoception. If we're not noticing those internal cues, we're not noticing that we're sick, we're not noticing that we're in pain, we're not noticing that we need to go to the bathroom until we're busting, and then that can cause issues holding our bladder and all sorts of things, or constipation and stuff like that. So really impacts a lot of different areas and a lot of different things, and particularly with our safety and our health and well-being as well. So now I will open it up to questions. I hope that that provided you with some kind of information, some stuff. Like I said, this is really the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more stuff. And like I said, sensory processing and sensory profiles and all that stuff can be really kind of complicated and nuanced, especially when you take into account people's experiences and their history and you know, if there's been any trauma or any adverse life experiences can add to that as well. There's a whole other sort of space which we didn't even touch on today about sensory and attachment, and how our sensory systems and that can really come into play with attachment and attachment difficulties, or creating positive and healthy attachments. I didn't think that we would have time to go through that today, and we definitely didn't, because it's 1:45 and I like to try and give people enough time to ask questions. But if that's something you're interested in, I'm sure we could maybe do something else on that, or how to might touch on it next time. But it's really, yeah, that was just very much hopefully the tip of the iceberg and gave you some helpful information. So yeah, if you have any questions, fire away. I will have a look if you want to pop them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself if you're online, or if you're in the room, you can ask a question. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's really helpful. I think
No worries.
I see myself. I think the sensory and attachment session would be really helpful as well.
Sorry, I missed some of that. You were kind of cutting in and out. What was that?
The sensory processing and attachment session.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. That's okay. I also have we have a projector running for in here, and it's coming through the projector, so maybe that's also why it's a little
Okay.
off. Yeah, no worries. I'll pop that down maybe on our list of ones to do sometime in the future. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's great. Thank you so much for that feedback. We'll yeah, pop that on the list. I think I just saw a question come through on the chat. When working with children who may not have had a sensory assessment yet, but you can see signs of what their needs might be, how best can you work within their needs in session? For example, high threshold, include more intense movement. Yeah, I think doing exactly like you said, like what you can, like if you're noticing that they are really sensitive to sounds and they're like looking around the room when they hear something or they hear a car outside, maybe just doing what you can to kind of help with that. Or like you said, high movement needs, having opportunities for them to move around. So I don't know what it looks like for you necessarily, but can we go for a walk for our session, or can we have 5 minutes of like, let's do some movement, or let's do some yoga together, or let's whatever. Having opportunities to just make that a part of your sessions, or what your times look like together. It's really difficult with some of that movement, particularly that vestibular stuff, is that sometimes kids like they need that information, that movement, but that can also very easily get to a point where then they're dysregulated. So, you know, I have a kid who's like swinging, we're great, and then they've like hit that threshold and now they're like super dysregulated because they've almost had too much, or one type of movement swinging can be really regulating while the other can be really alerting for their system. Again, that was another thing I didn't really talk about, is sort of that window, sort of like the window of tolerance, but sort of that window of like arousal and alertness. So we can kind of be over aroused and it can be really like, wow, this is crazy, super overstimulated, so much going on, or we can kind of be under where we're really low and sort of slow and moving, or you can be in the middle somewhere where it can be really nice. So for example, I have a kid who we have a big round sort of spiderweb type of swing. And if they lie on that, on their stomach and swing, they're like super chill, almost falling asleep. Whereas we also have that normal sort of U-shaped swing that you might swing on at the park. If we're swinging on that, we're getting really excited and hyped up. I think, yeah, in having opportunities for including movement is great. Just being aware that depending on the kid, and that's really one of those trial and error, you'll notice it when it happens. Depending on the person that you're working with, or the child, or yourself, you know, some things might end up making you more alert and kind of going over the other way. But again, depending on the person, depending on the kid, having opportunities for more movement, I think, is really good. And finding ways to do that in, I guess, things like body weight exercises can be really nice because they are often kind of more about regulating stuff. Or, sometimes we might have, I'm sure Hannah will get into this, but if kids are part of their day-to-day, can you just help me carry in this really heavy bag of groceries, or can you help me carry this backpack, or doing some of that really nice, I guess, contained kind of movement, so that whether it's like something like a swing and it's rhythmic and consistent in that way, or it's that movement that we want, something like, can we do like holding ourselves in a squat position, or doing push-ups, or doing wall pushes, or wall sits, or something that we kind of have to contain ourselves, because that's less likely to kind of get them really hyped up. I hope that answers your question, Amy. Sorry, Amy, if you're talking, I can't hear you. I just saw that your little thingy popped up as blue, but I can't hear you. Joe, who's just in the room, has a question, so I might just answer hers while you're typing, Amy.
Is it fair to say that the sense of interoception is considerably bigger and far more complex than really any of the others? Do you think, given that, like, it's not new, but certainly emerging, like you said, that we're going to start trying to pull those apart as being lots and lots of other different senses?
Possibly.
Because something like hunger, for example, is a very early learned cue if you think about infancy. But something like knowing you need to go to the toilet, or knowing you feel shame, very, very complex, much later developing skills. Yeah.
I look, possibly. I think that interoception is super complex.
Yeah.
And it's like almost its own thing. So Kelly Mailer is OT in America, and that's kind of her thing. She really focuses on interoception. She's got a book, and she's really great and has lots of great stuff about interoception. But yeah, I was reading through the book and kind of going through and exploring that stuff, and I'm like, wow, this is really, really complicated. There's a lot going on.
Like a milestone hierarchy for that kind of thing, like there is with learning to walk, for example. There's milestones that kids tend to hit as they grow.
There could be. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think a lot of the time, like in her book, she kind of talks about interoception being like just how it's uncomfortable for some people, and how we maybe just need to, particularly with like feeling those emotions or noticing those internal sensations, and that letting people kind of like, it's okay that it's uncomfortable. And sometimes I think we kind of push this, like, well, you need to feel what's happening in your body, and you need to feel these feelings in your body, which is important, but also then acknowledging that can be really uncomfortable, especially if the way that they interpret those internal senses and cues can be different than others. But yeah, I think it's a whole area that I'm kind of really starting to understand more.
Yeah, like it's really interesting. Like if you think about auditory sounds, nobody's like, is that sound too loud for me? Like it's just this immediate, I know what that is and I know how to solve it.
Yeah.
Whereas like something like anger, I'm already doing all of the things before I've noticed what's going on inside.
Yeah. And so we might see people often say like, oh, they went like 0 to 100. Yeah. It's like, well, maybe they didn't. They just didn't notice the 1 to 99.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a response from Amy. Thank you, Elise and Zoe. We'll work with parents who are keen to understand sensory profile in their child more best way through an OT for a sensory assessment, knowing which assessment to ask for, what they'll gain from, and how it takes can be helpful to relate to parents. Yeah, I would say going to an OT, making sure that you're going to someone who does have, experience in sensory processing stuff and understands sensory processing. Not, depending on the OT you go to, that may not be their kind of area of specialty or their kind of jam, particularly if they might do more physical things or like home mods. It might be, it might not be. But I think absolutely kind of saying to the parents, or if you want to sort of help them find an OT, say, ask for an OT, say that this is specifically what you want. You're after wanting to understand more about my child's sensory profile and their sensory preferences. I want to have some, I guess, information on what their sensory profile is, some strategies we can support them. And yeah, I think that could be really helpful depending on the kid and depending on how they interact with the therapist, depending on the family, depending on how the therapist does it. It might take longer. I would, depending on the person, I would typically want to see them. Maybe we'll do that sensory profile in that initial session, but also maybe we want to do a couple of sessions together with the kid after that to help explain to the parents what's happened with their sensory profile, what we've come up with, explaining to the child what's going on in their body. And then depending on what's going on, if they need sort of that more therapy to really help them notice, some kids are really like, oh yeah, that makes heaps of sense, I'll happily implement this stuff. Whereas some will be like, you're talking about the things that make me uncomfortable? Absolutely not. I'm not going to have a bar of that. I don't want to talk with you about these things that make me uncomfortable because they make me uncomfortable and I don't like that. So I guess depending on the young person, it might, and depending on, I guess, the funding ability and the ability for the parents to access the sessions, it might be that we just want to go this kind of more parent coaching, psychoeducation for the parent sort of approach, which might be good if the child is, sorry, that's just our work phone ringing. Yeah, whether that might work for the person. I guess I would say ask whichever OT you're kind of going to go with or refer to, I would say ask them what their thoughts are initially. Like our process here at Sisu is that we have an intake phone call, and sorry, just passing off the phone. In that intake phone call, they might say, this is what I'm after, this is what I'm looking for. We'll want to get some information on the young person, on the child, sort of see how would they engage, what's it like for them, and then we might be able to give a little bit more information on how long it might take, how many sessions. And yeah, sometimes I do have parents, we do a sensory profile and we go through all this stuff and they kind of say, okay, I knew that already. And I'm like, great. So I guess it making sure that the parents are clear on what they're wanting to get out of it, whether it's they want to just understand better, whether it's that they want strategies, maybe it's that they want a report or a letter that they can then give to school or daycare or workplaces, whatever it might be, would be good to kind of, yeah, ask them about. Yeah. Is that helpful, Amy? I think there's also, like, depending on what's going on for the young people, there are resources that you can look into, and parents can do their own kind of research. But as I said, the sensory system and sensory stuff can be kind of complicated. So if they're feeling like they've done their research and they're not getting their questions answered, they feel like they need some more support, I would definitely go to an OT. Or if they're sort of like, no, we really want to have a really good and clear understanding, then go find an OT who kind of specializes in that. I think is good. But I'm all for people having a look, just obviously trying to vet their online information that they get. Like everything, we want to make sure that we're getting good and accurate information. Any other questions? I know we've just got a couple minutes pretty much before 1 o'clock, so I'll answer any last questions that anyone has. Or if you have any other recommendations for what other lunch and learns you're interested in, please let us know. But we run them on the first Tuesday of every month. What can we do for more research on what these might work for each sense and for those who are hypersensitive? I think you can start with having a look, just online, if you want to, sort of going, what some things that help for these sensory things. And there are some, like I know there's a couple of like OTs who run blogs or who have Instagram pages who have things like Neuroinclusion is one OT that I follow on Instagram, and she is a neuroaffirming OT, runs her own OT practice, and she sometimes will put posts up there about like what these accommodations might look like for this sort of sensory thing. So that can be kind of helpful. I would say to have a look at. Yeah, I feel like that would be kind of a good place to start, having a look in around there. Whereas if there can be some really helpful information online. Also, depending on who the person is, even just like trying to have those conversations with them about it, you know, like depending on if they're a child or a teenager, or even if it's yourself, like trying to notice what things help them, what things work, or trying to help them identify what's going on. Like, hey, I've noticed that this is going on. I wonder if, hey, I noticed when we were in there, you were covering your ears. I wonder if that was a little bit loud for you. And then if they're covering their ears, can we help them implement anything that helps reduce the sound, like headphones, or can we help them sit in a certain part of the room that's less noisy, or by a window so it's not reverberating, but the window's open and the noise can kind of go out beside them, or whatever it might be. You know, finding things that work for that young person can be helpful. But I would say if you're wanting to sort of do online kind of looking in research, try and have a look at some of those OTs. I think neuroinclusion is really great. There's a couple of other OTs who have Instagram pages, and that can be really helpful as well. But I'm sure that Hannah will probably talk about it in our next Lunch and Learn, where she's going to talk more about strategy. So hopefully that can be helpful as well. Hope that answered your question briefly. Sorry, it wasn't super detailed. Any other questions? Otherwise, I might. Presentation stopped. Oh, that's okay. I might leave it there, and yeah, hopefully you can join us for our next one in a month's time. And if you have any other questions, anything that's popped up, feel free also just to like send us an email. If you have any other questions that popped up, or you felt like something wasn't quite answered, feel free to email us and we'll get back to you when we can. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye-bye. See you next time.